Hi, I'm Deboki, and this is Okie Dokie Boki, and today I am finally getting around to doing my wrap-up video on the BookTube Prize finals for the nonfiction category. So for those of you who don't know, the BookTube Prize is a community prize anyone can sign up to judge, and there, at least last year, there were two categories. There was fiction and nonfiction. So I decided to sign up and judge the nonfiction round. I judged the first round, which I already did a video for. I think that was the octafinal round, and now I am doing my video for the last round for the finals. And so the winners for this were announced at the beginning of October. I know, I'm like I said, I'm coming at this very late. But the winner was Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. The second prize was Our Bodies, Their Battlefields by Christina Lamb. And then third was Red Comet by Heather Clark. So just to get the awkward part out of the way, those three books that won were my three least favorite books of this finals round. And it's fine. Like, I kind of expected that to happen. These books have a clear importance and appeal to them that I understand and respect, even if they made choices that I personally responded very kind of critically or negatively to. It's kind of funny coming to this so late, compared to when we actually all submitted our ballots, because, I had my thoughts that I registered at the time that I was voting, and now I have the tail end of my thoughts. I have more of okay, over the weeks since then, how have my feelings about these books evolved, and how do I think about how I thought about those books? And overall, I still feel pretty okay with my voting decisions. It's just really interesting because I did not pick up on this at the time, but the ways that I ended up voting ended up kind of falling in very distinct thirds. So at the bottom, my bottom third, there was a very clear theme. My middle third, there was a very clear theme, and then a top third, very clear theme. And I did not process that at all in the moment, and only saw it later on. At the bottom, I had two books that I thought were telling important stories, but analyzing them in ways or structuring them in ways that I found frustrating. In the middle were two biographies about iconic American figures who died very young, and whose importance has meant that even if I hadn't read a lot about them before, I felt like I had absorbed a lot of information about their legacy through cultural osmosis. And at the top were two narrative nonfiction works built around traumatic events that in both of these cases happened to women and that are heavily tied to their experiences as mothers. And again, I did not realize that my votes were so structured in this way, but I don't know, it does make it a little bit easier for me to structure this video. It's basically going to be three little mini double reviews in one overall video. So let's start with my bottom two books. We have Our Bodies, Their Battlefields by Christina Lamb and Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Our Bodies, Their Battlefields is built on Lamb's experience as a journalist in conflict zones, and it focuses particularly on the sexual violence wielded against women in those zones, which turn rape into both crime and weapon of war. I think my experience of reading this book would have been pretty different if there had been one, kind of subtle, but also I think kind of major change to it, which is I think I would have been a lot less frustrated reading it if everything that had gotten thrown in at the end in the postscript and the acknowledgments had been moved to the beginning of the book or had somehow made up more of the book's overall structure and flow. This is a very difficult book to read. There's just no way around that, and it's not meant to be easy. It is a description of incredibly horrible acts of violence, and it's not like Lamb is trying to hold back in any way. I mean, if she is, that only means that the truth is so much more awful than any of us could I don't know, conceive of. And so particularly at the beginning of the book, because of the choices she makes in terms of how she's going to structure this book overall, where in these beginning chapters, you're going to basically different conflict zones and hearing different stories of sexual violence, you're basically getting chapter after chapter of different conflicts with the same gruesome sexual violence. And so it truly feels in the beginning every 10 to 20 pages, you're just reading different ways for women's bodies to be mutilated in different settings. This is not my first time reading a book that describes harrowing violence and particularly sexual violence, but what made this book difficult to read is that it was structured in a way where there just wasn't the space to provide the analysis and depth of context that those other books that I've read had. I think that each individual chapter of this book stands really well on its own. They each read an incredibly powerful and horrible news article, but the way that this book is structured, it feels like each of these individual news articles are basically kind of stapled together to create the overall book. And the overall effect is relentless and overwhelming. And it gets to a point where these graphic descriptions begin to blur together. And so I kept reading all of these chapters with so many questions about like what the book was trying to do and what Lamb's role in covering and telling these stories was, and like what it was that she was thinking about when she structured this book. And there were moments where she would like brush up against those kind of tensions only to immediately pull back. And it wasn't until the postscript and acknowledgments that I felt like she got to the bulk of any kind of analysis on her role or even the overarching questions that it seemed like the book was trying to build to. And the take I have on that is that it probably feels like her way of decentering her point of view in a book that is about other people's traumas. And I think that is like fair and overall like a very like good thing to strive for. But it's also sort of an older model of journalism that I think is becoming increasingly outdated and out of place as consumers become more cognizant that journalism is made by people, and those people bring their own perspectives and their lack of perspectives into the story. And that doesn't always have to matter, but I do think it's important in the context of this book, because the question that this book is often building towards and trying to grapple with is, why does the world at large not seem to care about this violence? And I felt with the way that this book chose to describe the violence that these women are experiencing and also to describe the act of interviewing, it actually would have been a tremendously useful thing to assess both Lamb's individual role as a journalist and the media's role in conveying these stories, instead of just treating the media as some kind of like outside observer. I debated whether I was going to bring this up, but I kind of want to in the context of this media discussion. Lamb got into a little bit of some hot water after Prince Philip died because she wrote an article in the Sunday Times where she described him as a, quote, often crotchety figure offending people with gaffes about slitty eyes, even if we secretly rather enjoyed them. And that was a very specific reference to gross jokes that Prince Philip had told in the past about Asian students. Lamb did apologize. It was, I think, kind of like an unsatisfactory, mealy-mouthed, self-contradictory sort of apology. She like brings up the fact that so much of her work is about documenting injustice, which I don't know if you want to say that like, hey, my job is this thing, you know, in a circumstance where you are not doing that thing. I'm not saying don't read this book because of that, because I think that there are parts of this book that are just so tremendously important aside from this situation, even if it's a shame that like she is, you know, kind of brought this on herself. I'm bringing it up because I think it speaks to what I find ultimately really frustrating about this book overall. It's its inability to process the bigger picture around its central narratives. The book wanted to understand what it means to live in a world with this tremendous and horrific violence directed at women in war, but ultimately it doesn't seem to have the structural or analytical means to connect the world these acts take place in to the world that ignores it. And the media is a big link between these worlds. And so to me, the fact that the book keeps walking right up to contending with that a few times, but then like immediately jumps back, speaks to a really big missed opportunity to get to some of the why that the book is asking. Again, I think this book does have important parts to it. It is documenting really important stories that need to be told. So I would suggest, if you're thinking about reading it, to take it just a chapter or two at a time. I think that better suits the very discrete nature of how the book is structured, and also just makes it a lot less overwhelming to confront everything that the book is trying to get across. Next in this pair of books is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, and this is probably the book that has aged the least well among all of these books since the time that I did my ranking. I think I was originally more generous to it because I do like respect what I think the book is trying to do. I just don't necessarily think it does it very well. Wilkerson's goal is to provide us with an understanding of America's history as told through caste, a system that in our country is founded on slavery and has been perpetuated through racism. In doing so, she compares this to India's caste system as well as to Nazi Germany. And again, I think that the original intention of this book and I think the original premise of it is something that I agree with. The problem for me is just analytical. There are moments where the framework of caste, where the use of things like dominant or subordinate caste in place of race begins to feel rigid to the point of clunky, like when Wilkerson uses it to speculate about personal motivations in academic publications without providing any clear evidence for what those personal motivations are. And then at other points, I found the analysis incredibly thin and flimsy, like when she kind of glosses over her definition and assessment of Asians, Latinos, and Indigenous people as middle caste. The chapter that kind of manages to embody both of these at once for me was the chapter on health disparities, where her argument builds on this idea that that more education and wealth corresponds to worse health if you're not white, almost like there is a cost to trying to escape your caste. First off, I think if you're going to only be dedicating 7 pages to exploring the many complicated facets of health with the also complicated interplay of race and class in America, like I think you're facing an uphill battle to begin with. But I do also think like with the right work, with the right framing, you can do a decent analysis or summary that conveys that complexity. I don't think this chapter successfully did that. Instead, I thought it read as both incoherent and contradictory. It felt like a string of different studies chosen for their ability to confirm the thesis of the chapter, and then linked together without any thought for how they linked together. It's just, this chapter was frustrating because there's so much complex interplay between all these factors that's going on, and the picture it paints feels overly simplistic to the detriment of its own argument without like actually needing it to be, because I think the overall point that there is a complex interplay between race, class, and health is a very important one, so I don't understand the need to simplify it in this way to tell this story. And so going back to the fact that I do think that the use of caste to describe race in America is useful, but I just kept coming back to this question because of how it was using caste in its analysis, where I didn't understand what the point of it was in the context of this book, like what it was teaching me that any other writing I've read that has used racism or white supremacy to describe America, like what those writings haven't. Like it wasn't helping me to actually see anything new or to understand things in a different way. Instead, the book felt like a way for people to talk about race while keeping the actual use of the word race to a minimum. My takeaway for why these 2 books ended up at the bottom of my overall ranking is that they're actually the most like nonfiction I usually read, especially for nonfiction book club. So unlike, say, biographies, which we'll get to shortly, which I don't read that often, I have a clear sense for what I want out of these books and also for what I find frustrating in these kinds of books. So I think like from the beginning, these books were destined to either be at the top of my list or at the bottom of my list. Even a mediocre book of this type is probably going to be worse to me than like a mediocre biography. Of the 2, I would be much more likely to recommend Our Bodies, Their Battlefields, just because I do think that the individual chapters stand on their own as like really important and necessary documents about the use of rape as a weapon of war. Okay, so now we're on to my middle books. These are the biographies. And so we've got Red Comet by Heather Clark, which is a biography of Sylvia Plath, and the other book is The Dead Are Arising, a biography of Malcolm X that was written by Les Payne and Tamara Payne. Let's start with Red Comet. This was the top of my bottom 3, so it's the one that I liked the most out of the ones that I liked the least at the time that I read it, but it's actually aged a lot better than I thought it would. But let me start by saying that this is a 1,000-page biography about Sylvia Plath, and boy, does it feel like it. I actually listened to it on audiobook, and I think when I looked at the length, it's a 45-hour audiobook, and I was just like, you can have 45 hours of audiobook. I think that this is the kind of book that you know if you are the target audience for. Like if you hear about a book that is 1,000 pages of every minute detail of Sylvia Plath's life that is available to us, and if you hear that and you get excited, this book is perfect for you. There's nothing to get mad about. There's nothing to dislike. This book does that very, very well. I am not that target audience. This book is exhaustive. It is also, to me, exhausting. There are just so many details in this book where I was like, I don't know, it's like about babysitting or something, or meals being cooked, where whatever was being described, I was just sitting there like, I don't care. Like, I don't care. There's no substance to my response. It's just that I don't care. I don't have any strong feelings about why I don't care. I don't have any intellectual argument about what should be there, what shouldn't be there. I just don't care. Like, that's it. It's just like a gut response. And the thing is, I had that gut response But I also don't think like that the book is bad. I think it's actually very good at what it sets out to do. I think its goal is to be a comprehensive book about Sylvia Plath's life, and I am just not the right person for a comprehensive book about Sylvia Plath's life. With that said, I did kind of reach a zen place with this book after like maybe the first third of it, which is a bit bad because like, sure, there are a lot of books where you kind of get through the first third and like after that it kind of picks up, like, you know, everything is kind of laid in place, and after that picks up, you get to the exciting stuff and whatever. The first third of a 1,000-page book is like still about like 300 something pages, right? Which is the length of a full book. It's like the length of some of the other books that we were reading for the BookTube prize. So that is a long time to have to sit with the book before you start to get invested in it. And that first third for this book was really tough because it starts with like Plath's parents, it starts with her own childhood. There are a lot of details that again I don't care about, and there's also like a lot of speculation because it's childhood stuff where like there's not as much documentation to really go off of. So I got to a point with some of these details where I was like, I don't understand the point of even bringing this up because we don't know if it's true, we don't know what we're speculating on. It just wasn't very interesting to me. But I do think that the book ended up growing on me for a few reasons. The first is just local. This is a very Massachusetts heavy book. Plath was born in Boston, raised around Wellesley, and she spent like pretty big chunks of her life in the Northampton, Amherst area. She went there for college and moved back there after, and then spent time at Boston University. So for me, as someone who went to BU and who now lives in the Northampton, Amherst area, that was all just cool in like a local history kind of way. The second thing that has really stuck with me after having read this book is the way that it portrays Plath as not just like this creative writer, but also like as this very effective and ambitious professional. The book really made me appreciate Plath's focus when it came to getting published when she was really young, to like how she kind of transitioned into helping her husband out a lot with becoming a more successful and established poet. I feel like when I describe it, it makes it sound like I'm describing her as the original girl boss, which I'm not. I just think that the book took a lot of care to really establish how Plath had a clear idea of the interplay between her professional and creative ambitions. I think what ultimately helped me enjoy this book was listening to it at 2.5 to 2.8x speed on audiobook because, you know, for someone like me who just had so many of those I don't need that level of detail moments, that was just the right like level of listening. And I actually ended up kind of loving that audiobook experience for me because it was just the right level of investment. I wouldn't really have enjoyed having to do a close reading of the book, but it was perfect for when I wanted to just kind of listen to something while I was driving or while I was cleaning or whatever, working around the house. It just was like the perfect experience in that way. I think I might actually end up going back to this audiobook in the future. So yeah, this was a book that has really done a lot better in my memory than I expected it to when I was reading it. The second book in my biography middle tier is The Dead Are Arising, and this is a biography of Malcolm X that draws on a tremendous amount of research that Les Payne did. Les Payne died in 2018, and so his daughter Tamara Payne, who had been working on the book with him, she actually completed it based on these different notes. And I think the feeling that I got while reading this book is that like it's written very much from an author who is trying to understand more of the contours of someone he greatly respected and admired for like many decades. And that is potentially a dangerous road for biography. I mean, there's even a scene where Payne is like referencing himself being in a past seminar that Malcolm X was like lecturing at. And I think that kind of thing can veer a little too close into biopic kind of moments where it feels like you're lauding all of the ways this person has chosen to live without necessarily like engaging fully with them. But the biography is pretty careful about not doing that, and instead uses interviews and Malcolm X's own autobiography to get kind of at the differences between how Malcolm X presented himself publicly versus the other stories that exist and get to many of the complications around his life. I think this book is sort of informally structured in a way that explores Malcolm X's life through the different ideologies that have shaped it, starting with Marcus Garvey's Pan-Africanism movement that really influenced and played a big role in his parents' life, to his own involvement and later disillusionment with the Nation of Islam. The result is a biography where there are large chunks of Malcolm X's personal life, especially his adult life, that we don't learn about, like his marriage or his experience as a father. That kind of almost seems to happen like off page. But I like the focus of this book as well. It means that there's a lot of space dedicated to movements that I knew less about and to exploring their origins and their practices and their principles. And those self-referential moments where Payne is talking about himself or his friends and how they responded to Malcolm X, those are brief but pretty impactful because they provide more of a sense for what it was like to be in the audience and to engage with his ideas. All of that was woven in with Malcolm X's own personal journey and complications, making for a biography that manages to be both focused and personal, but provide a lot of depth beyond just the subject being described. So looking more broadly, I can see how these two books ended up in my middle category overall because, as I said, I'm not the biggest biography reader. It's just not a genre in nonfiction that I've been super drawn to. I guess I've read like quite a few memoirs, but I think that's a little bit different because that's probably more about how people choose to present themselves and their stories versus, you know, a biography where it is someone else assessing somebody's life. I don't think that these books necessarily converted me into a biography reader, but it did maybe make me reconsider it or maybe think more about like why I do or don't read biographies. And I still don't have a clear-cut answer. They did definitely convert me into someone who wants to read more of Sylvia Plath's and Malcolm X's writing, because I think one of the things that these books did really well, and maybe just by their nature were always going to be able to do, was put a lot of their writings and their thoughts into context, into the historical and personal context for both of them. I would recommend either of these biographies to anyone who's interested in them. Again, with the Sylvia Plath one, I think that's one where you're gonna wanna know yourself going into it. If you guys have suggestions for other biographies to read, let me know. There's a few that I'm like now considering, now that I am in this new phase of maybe potentially considering reading more biographies and trying to see if I can kind of like get a sense for what I like or don't like about different biographies and different people's approaches to them. And now we are on to my top two books, and these were both narrative nonfiction that I felt were really strongly grounded in the experience of women at like the center of the narratives. The first is the memoir Inferno by Catherine Cho, where she documents her experience with postpartum psychosis after the birth of her son, which led to her having to spend about 2 weeks in a psychiatric ward. This was the first book that I ended up reading for the BookTube Prize, which kind of took me completely by surprise, like just the fact that I decided to reach for it first, because I was completely fresh off a miscarriage, which I've talked about in previous video. It was a miscarriage that ended up with me having to go to the hospital, all around like a very bad experience emotionally and physically and everything, and I was very anemic afterwards, and I also like through the whole experience had a lot of anxiety like before, during, and after. I was very much in a place at the time that I picked this book up where I was really not I was like fast forwarding through scenes in like Bridgerton, for example, where there were like scary pregnancy scenes. I was like really in a place of like, I don't want to read or see anything about pregnancy and childbirth that is going to make it scarier than my experience already has been. But for some reason, I picked this book up first and I completely devoured it in one sitting. Like I started it and I had to finish it. Cho tells her story through a number of different points, including the traditions of her Korean family, the experience with an abusive ex-boyfriend, to her relationship with her husband, and ultimately the experience of being in the hospital. It's one of those personal narratives that weaves a lot of threads together, but never too tightly. It lets things sit and build where they need to. There has to have been a lot of clarity going into writing this book, but I think a lot of that clarity is told through the fact that the book just lets things unfold without feeling the need to emphasize and like hammer in why Cho is dwelling in on any certain thing. Like I said, I read this at a point where I was in a very uncomfortable place with like thinking about pregnancy, and this did not soothe any of my fears about pregnancy. In fact, there's definitely stuff at the end where she's talking about the difference in care she received in the US because she had been traveling there versus how she would have been treated if she was in the UK where she usually lives. And that was I don't know, that was it was not great. It was one of those things that you read about the US system of healthcare and of maternity care, and you're just like, great, fuck it. And none of that section was reassuring in any way, shape, or form. But sometimes you don't need to be reassured. Sometimes you just need to keep reading. And this book is written with a flow and a pace that just kept me in the book. It just kept me sticking with the story and seeing where it was going to go. It's both an easy and difficult read at the same time, and so I'm very glad that I read it. If you're in the same boat that I was in, where you're feeling unsure about, whether or not you want to read something that's about the challenges of pregnancy and giving birth, I don't necessarily want to be like, oh yes, don't worry about it. It's fine. It's okay. I don't want to issue any kind of blanket statement like that. But for me, there were parts of this book that were definitely really, really hard to read, especially the way that she describes the psychosis that kind of sets in and how it affects the way that she sees the world. Like, a lot of that was very difficult to read, but it was also a book that helped me think through some of the things that I've been afraid of. It hasn't necessarily fixed them in any way. I'm not gonna like assign some magical power to this book when it's like, that is not the point of this. The point of the book is her own story, but I am very glad that I read it. And the other book in this category that I absolutely loved was After the Last Border by Jessica Goudeau. The book follows two refugees who came to America like from different places and at different times. And one is Muna, who has come to the US from Myanmar in 2007, and the other is Hasna al-Salam, who came from Syria in 2016. At the time they arrive, Muna is a mother with young children, while Hasna is older. She has grandchildren. And so the book traces their stories of them and their family through different stages of their experience with the conflicts and ultimately with resettlement. And so through them and their families, we see how they've come to the decision to resettle in the US and how the shifting American attitudes and policies around resettlement have affected them in very personal ways in their daily lives. There are a few chapters in this book that kind of step back and are a little bit more analytical and big picture oriented, where Goudeau spends more time giving context to the history of how America has approached refugees and asylum. But the bulk of this book is focused on the women's personal experiences, which I think is why I love it so much. There's a version of this book that would be more of those history chapters, and I would enjoy reading that book as well. But I also like this version of the book where the focus is so much more personal and at times even really kind of mundane, like focused on details that don't necessarily seem like vital to the story being told about like resettlement, but that are definitely vital to these women's own personal stories and how they want them to be told. I think I got like 10 pages into this book and I felt like I was probably gonna end up loving it. Like, I had a strong feeling about it because the writing just really drew me in, especially in the details that Goudeau uses to fill in the setting and emotions. There's an author's note in the beginning that's expanded on more in the afterword, where Goudeau explains more of how she wrote the book, because it really seems to be much more collaborative than just like her strictly writing this entire story, this entire book about these two women's lives. It's really her in conversation with Muna and Hasna to tell their story, and I think that comes through in a lot of those details, especially, again, those mundane, seemingly inconsequential ones. To me, while this is not a book that is specifically about being a woman, it is much more generally focused about being a refugee, there is a very clear connection between Muna and Hasna in terms of the choices that they're having to make as wives and mothers. And that's not to be reductive about their roles. It's just that so many of the choices they're having to make are about protecting and taking care of their families. And these are choices that are built as well on their culture, because, that's so much of what culture is. It's the way that we build worlds that we're going to live in that are, centered around our families and the ways that we're going to relate to each other. So what I ended up really liking about this book is that it's by no means trying to be a universal story. If anything, I think the choice to tell the story of two different women emphasizes that there is not a universal story. There are clear parallels and similarities in their stories, but we can see clear ways that, their experiences are different. And some of those differences are illuminated by, changes in America's asylum policies, which is why those chapters are useful. But, there's also just the fact that people are different and live different lives, even if they have this like one major thing in common. And so I just came out of this book with a huge appreciation for the work that went into it, to illustrate both those exceptional and unexceptional details of the women's stories. And I think this might be one of my favorite books I've read this year. And I'm not surprised that these two books ended up at the top of my list, that they ended up being my favorites of this judging round, because, they combine narrative with analysis, which is what I love the most in nonfiction. And in the same way that the books at the bottom of my list did that, these do that as well. And so these just did them in a way that I really, really enjoyed, versus the ones at the bottom, which made choices, as I've talked about, that I didn't necessarily like as much. So it's not surprising to me that in this case, where these two books made choices that I actually found really compelling, that it basically meant that they were going to be my favorite books of the bunch. Inferno is written in a way that manages to connect a lot of different stories into a really cohesive story, while primarily still being about this one very awful experience. And After the Last Border is written in a way that I think thoughtfully and carefully uses other people's experiences to tell a story that is easy to flatten into like a very simplistic story of struggle, so that instead the book is joyful and sad and hopeful and like many other emotions told through the vivid setting and complicated family relationships that shape the two women's lives. So those are my BookTube prize thoughts. Finally. I'm really glad that I did the BookTube prize this year. It was my first year judging it, and I'm so glad for basically two big reasons. It got me to read a lot of nonfiction that I hadn't read before, and it got me to kind of crystallize a little bit more my thoughts around what I'm looking for in nonfiction and what it is that I like and don't like. And I hope you guys enjoy this, so thanks you guys for watching, and bye!